Updated with Defense Department response appended, 1:30 p.m. Est, November 29, 2017, Mogadishu, Somalia. It was around 5 in the morning when Abdullahi Elmi heard a gunfire. Sitting in his small home in Bariaya, in southern Somalia, the farm administrator had been recording the names of the laborers who had worked the day before. Stacks of accounting books sprawled on the floor. Around him, across the room, his wife sat with their 3-year-old son who dozed as his mother rocked him back and forth in her arms. When the sound of gunshots began, Abdullahi thought they were too far away to be heading toward his farm. But within seconds they seemed to grow louder and closer, sending Abdullahi and his wife, carrying their young son, sprinting through the nearby forest of banana trees in search of safety. Sheltering beneath the long leaves, Abdullahi came across his neighbor, Gumi Hassan, who had also sprinted into the banana grove with his wife when he heard the barrage of gunfire. The two families waited for 20 minutes before they decided it was safe to return, and began walking cautiously back to their homes, both Abdullahi and Gumi careful to walk in front of their wives in case the gunfire returned. As the women entered their houses, the two men stood outside to see what had happened, eventually spotting Somali National Army soldiers walking in the distance. At first Abdullahi was relieved. The National Army must have come to stop their rival clan from attacking their farm, he thought. But as the soldiers saw the men, they raised their weapons, ordering Hassan and Elmi to get down on the ground. Blood from a gunshot wound poured into the earth around him. I put my hands up and they told us you are under arrest. Then I heard the noise from their big cars and I knew this was more than just a clan fight, Elmi said. They told my wife to go back in our home and then they went inside to search. I was pleading with them not to take anything. When the soldiers finished their search, they ordered the men to move with them toward the scene of the shooting. There Abdullahi and Gumi saw their fellow farmers' bodies sprawled across the ground. The small pot that one of them had been using to make tea still stood upright near the corpses. And they also saw what they later estimated to be around 20 American soldiers standing around the bodies. A Somali National Army soldier who was at the scene estimated 10 to 12 Americans were there. Abdullahi felt his chest tighten as he heard his friend, Ali Y, calling for help, blood from a gunshot wound pouring into the earth around him. One of the Somali soldiers ordered Abdullahi to put his head on the ground. The bottom of a boot belonging to an American soldier kept there. The U.S. LED operation on August 25 would result in the death of 10 civilians, including at least one child, and become the largest stain on U.S. ground operations in the country since the infamous Black Hawk Down incident in 1993. In the operation's aftermath, hundreds of people in the nearby town Afgoy flooded the city's streets demanding justice for those killed, and survivors on the farm refused to bury their dead until the Somali government recanted its allegations that they were members Al-Shabaab, and offered an apology. The Daily Beast conducted an investigation into the Bariaya operation and its aftermath, interviewing 3 of the operation's survivors over the phone from Mogadishu and meeting in person with a Somali National Army commander in charge of the Somali soldiers who assisted in the operation under the command of soldiers from U.S. Special Operations Forces. The Daily Beast also met in Mogadishu with over 24 Somali intelligence officers, political analysts, local leaders, and former and current government officials familiar with the incident. 2 of these individuals are also involved in an ongoing local, non-government-sponsored investigation into the incident. You are now subscribed to the Daily Digest and Cheat Sheet. We will not share your email with anyone for any reason. The Daily Beast also met in person with a commander of the Ugandan People's Defense Forces whose purview under the mandate of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force includes Bariaya, and who was approached by the Americans about their plan to recapture and hold Bariaya. The vast majority of these sources preferred to speak anonymously, either because they were not authorized to discuss the incident or because they feared possible retribution from either the Somali federal government or the Americans for doing so. The details that emerged paint a damning picture of at least one U.S. ground operation in the African nation. This includes U.S. special operators firing upon unarmed civilians, using human intelligence from sources widely considered untrustworthy to Somalis in the region, as well as government officials, and instructing their Somali counterparts to collect weapons that were being stored inside a home, not displaced on the field in the course of the firefight, and placing them beside the bodies of those killed prior to photographing them. In the aftermath of the incident, according to our sources, American diplomats also pressured the Somali government to bury the unfavorable findings of a Somali federal governmental investigation. Hours after the operation, AFRICOM released a statement noting that it was aware of allegations of civilian casualties in the operation and that AFRICOM was conducting an assessment into the situation to determine the facts on the ground. The AFRICOM press release also stated that the Somali National Army was conducting an operation in the area with U.S. forces in a supporting role. Yet a majority of bullet casings collected from the farm that was attacked, which were seen by the Daily Beast, were from American, not Somali National Army, weapons. This appears to confirm that the Special Operations Team did not command SNA while remaining behind during the operation, as the AFRICOM statement would have the public believe, but rather were responsible themselves for firing upon and killing unarmed civilians. According to Maj. Audricia Harris, a spokesperson for the Department of Defense, this incident remains under investigation, and the DOD cannot comment on any specifics of the employment of U.S. Special Operations Forces. She noted that U.S. Special Operations take all measures during the targeting process to avoid or minimize civilian casualties or collateral damage and to comply with the principles of the law of armed conflict. The complete list of queries and responses can be viewed here. The details surrounding the planning of this incident collected by the Daily Beast suggest, however, that the Special Operations Forces involved in this mission did not sufficiently vet the information they were presented with prior to carrying out this operation. Lower Shabelle has long been a hotspot in Somalia's decades of conflict, with Bariaya town at its heart. The area is one of the most fertile regions in the otherwise barren Somali landscape. Here farmers cultivate green fields of bananas, mangoes, and tomatoes running parallel to the Shabelle River, while businessmen sell the produce in the nearby capital Mogadishu. But the same lushness that makes the region attractive to farmers has also made it desirable real estate for Al-Shabaab. The plentiful crops are ripe for taxation, the vegetation is good for taking cover from drone surveillance, and the Shabelle River creates a natural barrier between Al-Shabaab and enemy forces, while its bridges create opportunities for Al-Shabaab's hit-and-run attacks. The Islamic extremist group has held sporadic control throughout the region since January 2009, when the Ethiopian forces that had helped oust the Islamic Courts Union, a confederation of Sharia courts that rose to power in southern Somalia, in 2006, withdrew from the region. Though in the years following the African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia, or AMISOM, retook some large towns and established forward operating bases throughout Lower Shabelle, the area remains one of the last large swaths of territory where Al-Shabaab maintains pockets of control. For years the heart of Al-Shabaab's dominance in the area of Lower Shabelle near Mogadishu could be found in Bariaya town, located just 45 kilometers from the capital. From this town the group ran courts they used to implement Sharia law in the region and organized attacks carried out in Mogadishu. According to Minister of Parliament Ahmed Moalim Fiki, the town had acted as Al-Shabaab's small capital, near Mogadishu. Bariaya had become a nightmare for the Somali government and created problems for Somalia's security partners. Fiki says, every security report Somali Parliament's Security Committee received Bariaya was included. The Americans appeared woefully unaware that in this vast and forest-rich region, Al-Shabaab isn't the only factor contributing to instability, and the Somali parliament wasn't the only one taking note of Bariaya. U.S. special operators recognized the town's strategic significance as well, which is why in July this year they approached the Ugandan People's Defense Force UPDF Brig. Gen. Kayanya Mahanga, whose responsibilities under AMISOM include Lower Shabelle, about a plan they had developed to retake Bariaya town and the surrounding region. Unlike U.S. operations in years past, this campaign wouldn't consist of targeted airstrikes or raids, both of which have seen relative success in Somalia. Instead, the U.S. wanted to hold the land they would capture and provide intermittent on-the-ground support with a local force in charge of maintaining control of the territory. According to Brig. Gen. Mahanga, the Americans were requesting the Department of State-sponsored equipment for building forward operating bases of FOBs, such as Caterpillars and Graders, from a nearby AMISOM FOB, as well as UPDF troops to be retasked with the Somali National Army to hold the terrain in Barriere and beyond. The UPDF general was skeptical of this plan. His troops were already overstretched across the region. Not only would they not be able to provide adequate security for the FOB building equipment, but he questioned whether he could lend enough troops to hold a new FOB with the Somali National Army, which he knew to be undertrained, under-equipped, and likely unable to hold any outposts themselves. And in addition to foolhardy planning of the hold-terrain operation, the Americans also appeared to be woefully unaware that in this vast and forest-rich region, al-Shabaab isn't the only factor contributing to instability. Further complicating the security landscape is the ongoing conflict among Somali clans, primarily the Haba Gidr and Biamal. The rivalry between them, like most clan conflict in the country, revolves around land and, with the emergence of a functioning Somali state, power. Though clan alliances and clan conflicts span centuries, the current flare-up in Lower Shabelle dates back 5 years when Biamal and Haba Gidr renewed their fight over the majority Haba Gid-controlled land. The Biamal, a smaller clan which have traditionally lived in Lower Shabelle, claim the land is rightfully theirs given their historic presence in the region, while the Haba Gidr began to migrate south to the fertile Lower Shabelle in the 1990s when civil war broke out and their clan won authority in the region. They maintain that having lived on the land for decades they can legitimately call it their own. But unlike centuries past, clan conflicts in modern Somalia have been complicated first by al-Shabaab and later by the presence of AMISOM, American Special Operations, and other foreign militaries operating in the country. Since al-Shabaab formed in 2007, the group has thrived on local conflicts, offering support to the militias in their clan wars in exchange for their firepower when al-Shabaab confronts government forces. But farmers in the region, who aren't part of these militias, though they are often armed to protect their land and livestock, aren't as lucky. When their territory is taken over by al-Shabaab, they don't have a choice either. Agree to pay taxes to the group and to live under their authority or risk disarmament and death. This modus operandi creates a military landscape ripe for confusion, where distinguishing al-Shabaab militants from armed farmers in al-Shabaab-controlled territories requires accurate, unbiased, on-the-ground intelligence. Yet because foreign militaries, including U.S. Special Operations, often rely either on clan militias or the Somali security forces which have incorporated some of these militias into their ranks, for human intelligence, there is ample opportunity for clansmen to label their rivals falsely as al-Shabaab, and garner the support of foreign forces, and their much more sophisticated weaponry, in their own clan wars. When the UPDF commander, cognizant of the difficulties of terrain and this kind of operation, turned down the Americans' request for UPDF support and advised against the mission, the Americans turned instead to the Somali National Army's 20th Brigade, a poor semblance of a military at best. These American guys are our friends, but they came in rushing into operations without understanding the SNA capability, I told the US guys. The SNA can't hold ground, they don't have the weapons to hold ground. Gen. Mahanga said, "These American guys are our friends, but they came in rushing into operations without understanding the SNA capability because they wanted to achieve something themselves, unlike the SNA's Special Forces Unit, DANAB, which has been trained by the Americans to operate alongside them in ground operations." The SNA brigade this U.S. team approached had not only never been trained by any U.S. special operators but also was led by a former al-Shabaab commander, Shigo Ahmed Ali, who had worked closely with the Biamal militia in the region, led by Abdullahi Ali Ahmed, also known as WAFO, in the lead-up to this operation. The Americans seemingly worked with them ignorant of both the clan dynamics, pitting WAFO's militia against Haba Gidr clansmen like those on the farm, and of a complaint, obtained by the Daily Beast, made by the Lower Shabelle Community Elders Committee to the regional president, the Minister of Interior, the United Nations Mission, the U.S. Embassy, the EU delegation and the African Union representative last year about WAFO's Biamal militia attacking civilians and using AMISOM protection to do so. The letter stated that AMISOM is sheltering and providing logistical support to Biamal militia forces, while BMAL militia is burning farms, looting properties and killing innocent civilians without discrimination, elders, children, women and youth under the AMISOM protection in their barracks. The Daily Beast also learned from multiple Somali government and security officials that the Americans were using a translator who had a history of suspected manipulation of U.S. forces. The translator, known as Bashir, had been involved in a 2016 operation in Galkayo, northern Somalia, in which a U.S. drone strike targeted and killed 22 members of a local militia which had been working in collaboration with U.S. forces, according to the Bureau for Investigative Journalism. After the incident, many believed Bashir was complicit in providing inaccurate intelligence to the American forces because the local force was from a rival clan to his own. Given that his wife is from the BMAL clan, many suspect Bashir had helped persuade the Americans that the Habajidr on the farm were al-Shabaab as well, though the reason the US would use a translator suspected previously of manipulating them into killing non-al-Shabaab combatants is unclear. We don't believe the Americans have any agenda to kill us. They don't have an agenda to support one clan against another, says Ali Osman Diblaw, one of the farmers who was attacked in the operation. But the BMAL clan used misinformation and propaganda to wrongly kill us. They persuaded the Somali government and the Americans that we are al-Shabaab, which we are not. Diblaw's farm is located on one of Lower Shabelle's fault lines where government soldiers and al-Shabaab militants meet. 6 days before the operation on his farm, the fighting had come so close to his village that he and other farmers fled, returning to their homes a day later when the smoke had settled and al-Shabaab militants vacated the area. The fighting he and other villagers heard was in Bariaya town, where even without the UPDF support, the American Special Operations Team had begun their campaign to retake and hold first Bariaya and then the surrounding area, according to UPDF Gen. Mahanga. At first, the strategy appeared to be working. The US and SNA teams successfully retook Bariaya and set up 4 outposts on each corner of the city in order to hold it against al-Shabaab as planned. With their farm just 1 kilometer away from Bariaya town, now seemingly under government control, Diblaw decided to meet with the SNA in Bariaya and explain the ongoing clan conflict in the nearly liberated area. Diblaw and some of his fellow villagers owned small arms, mostly old AK-47s, to protect their land against the BMAL, which he feared the SNA might misinterpret as the farmers being fighters for al-Shabaab. Diblaw walked with a friend and fellow villager, Ali Y, to Bariaya town where he met with Gen. Shigo, a rotund man who stands roughly 5 foot 5 inches tall. Shigo didn't give Diblaw the impression of a feared military commander, but a glimpse into the 56-year-old's life before he joined the Somali National Army proves otherwise. Prior to 2012, Shigo was an al-Shabaab commander who defected to government forces with between 50 and 100 of his fighters. But most suspect it was a defection born from the fear of being imminently captured by Somali government troops than a change of heart. The first battle his brigade fought with al-Shabaab under the SNA flag, they lost, along with a number of arms and military cars that fell into al-Shabaab's hands. The incident raised questions about whether the general had lost on purpose in an effort to continue supporting the extremist group. The Daily Beast met Shigo in Mogadishu, where 3 government officials say he was to be reprimanded for the emerging pattern of civilian casualties under his leadership in the part of Lower Shabelle, for which his brigade is responsible. Shigo denied those claims. According to Diblaw, during his meeting with General Shigo he explained that the BMAL and the Habajidr had been fighting over land in the area Shigo was now responsible for and suggested the general either disarm both groups or reconcile the 2 clans. He told us he would reconcile us with the BMAL and that there wasn't anything to worry about, Diblaw says. Upon returning to his village, he told the villagers about his agreement with Shigo and instructed them to place all of their small arms in one of the village's corrugated tin homes, per the instructions of Gen. Shigo. In an interview with the Daily Beast, Shigo denied having met with Diblaw prior to the operation, although immediately after the incident he told local media that he had talked with the farmers in the area and instructed them to put their weapons in their homes to avoid confusion about who was and wasn't al-Shabaab. Waiting for the next steps in the reconciliation process, Diblaw and other villagers returned to their fields, hoping to hear word from Shigo about when the reconciliation efforts would begin. But days later Diblaw and others in the village noticed something strange looming over their farms with a noise that pierced the sky around them. Staring at the sky from outside his home, Diblaw thought it looked like a strange crow circling the village. But the loud hum that pierced the otherwise peaceful landscape suggested otherwise. Diblaw knew this wasn't a bird. It was a drone. Shigo was an al-Shabaab commander who defected to government forces with between 50 and 100 of his fighters. It was coming in the morning, around 5 or 6 in the morning and again around 5 in the evening. Diblaw said, "It was clear the Americans with Shigo were interested in us, that's why they were using their spy drone above us." Diblaw returned to the general, begging Shigo to let him speak directly with the Americans so he could clarify who the villagers were. Diblaw suggested the foreign force search their farm so they could see the small arms and Diblaw could explain why the villagers were in possession of them. Again, Shigo told him to be patient and that the reconciliation process would begin soon. Diblaw returned to his village wary of the general, and feeling disheartened, knowing that without the general's support, he had no chance of trying to communicate with the Americans directly. The next day villagers spotted the drone hovering overhead again. Diblaw's concerns grew. He returned to Shigo for the third time, pleading to speak with the Americans. Again, Shigo denied him. That would be Diblaw's last plea for help. The next morning gunfire tore through his small village and Diblaw's concerns that the farmers had been mistaken for al-Shabaab were proven true. After gathering with roughly the 20 other villagers to say the morning prayer on Friday, Diblaw had crawled back into his bed hoping to rest a bit more before starting his day. Less than 10 minutes later he heard the sound of gunfire and sprinted out of his bed to his doorstep, from which he saw his neighbor, Ali Y, standing with his hands up and uniformed men in the distance. Diblaw immediately started running toward the forest behind his house. "I was barefoot and there were a lot of bullets hitting near me, but I didn't stop for 1 second. I ran and started heading in the direction of Bariya town. I thought the military there could stop the firing," he said. Arriving in Bariya, Diblaw first saw an SNA lieutenant, Muhammad Muhammadabur, and ran up to him, demanding to see Shigo. The lieutenant brought the wounded farmer to Shigo's outpost, where looking the general in the eye, Diblaw was overcome by a sense of both despair and bewilderment. "I asked him why all of this is happening. We just left him here yesterday and told him our concerns, and now the people were being killed," Diblaw said. "I told him, let us rescue the people who are still alive, let us see if we can save these people." Meanwhile, on the other side of the farm from Diblaw's house, Abdullahi and Gumi were being escorted to the center of the village by Somali National Army soldiers. Told to lie down on the ground, the two men could hardly believe the carnage around them. 10 of their friends were sprawled across the ground. Some, like Ali Y, the same man who'd gone to town with Diblaw the day before, were barely alive and calling weakly for help. The soldiers around them were not listening. Roughly 30 minutes earlier, Gumi had been praying with most of them, and saw the teapot they had begun to brew still sitting on the ground, the body of a preteen boy in a brown t-shirt and dark blue jeans stretched out beside it. He knew the others would have been waiting for the tea when the barrage of gunfire began. The Daily Beast has photographs of the villagers taken after the attack, although many are too graphic for publication. They show the teapot, a black water heater, and a large pot scattered around the boy's body. Near the boy, Gumi saw his friend, Dangawane, who had traveled with him from the nearby town Afgoy to their small village the day before. A few meters away was another wounded man, Abdullahi, weakly shouting, save me, in the direction of Gumi and Abdullahi Elmi. Just beyond was Ali Y, his chest bleeding, begging the men to help him, and another man, asking if someone could move his leg which had been contorted after he fell to the ground from a gunshot wound. The body of a preteen boy in a brown t-shirt and dark blue jeans stretched out beside the pot where he had boiled tea. Abdullahi asked the Somali soldiers if he could help the men. The Somali soldier looked at Abdullahi for a moment and agreed, but as he started to stand up, an American soldier stopped him. The American guy got angry and directed me to lie down, so I lay down with my chest on the ground and he put his boot on me to keep me there, Abdullahi said. With his head tilted to his side, Abdullahi could see the Somali soldiers entering the house where the farmers had kept their old AK-47s. Carrying the weapons out of the home, the Somali soldiers then placed them beside the bodies of the other villagers. He and Gumi also saw 3 of the American men, who Gumi describes as one tall man with 2 shorter men next to him, taking pictures of the bodies with the weapons placed beside them. One of the men was taking a picture with a small black camera that gave off a flash with each photo taken, while the other 2 were taking photos on their phones, Gumi says. A Somali National Army soldier who arrived later at the scene estimated there were between 10 and 13 U.S. special operators in the village who, he said, were Navy SEALs. As they were taking photos, Abdullahi saw the Americans point the Somali soldiers to a small house. They entered the makeshift shanty and emerged with a roughly 50-year-old man known as Hassan Doro, whose second name means chicken in Somali, because he is a chicken farmer. Abdullahi later learned from Hassan that the Somali soldiers found him lying under his bed where he had hidden once he heard the sound of gunfire. Back in Bariaya, Shigo had agreed to give Diblor a vehicle of SNA soldiers to take him to the farm. Shigo first said he was informing the Americans in Bariaya so they could warn their counterparts at the farm, and after around 15 minutes Diblor headed back in the direction of his village. When they arrived at the scene, Diblor could hardly believe what he saw, and looking at the American soldiers he was amazed by how well equipped they were. While the SNA soldiers were carrying AK-47s, the Americans had machine guns and 3 well-equipped armored vehicles. A Somali National Army soldier in Bariaya later described the Americans' weapons as looking like a more modern and smaller version of an M16, which were outfitted with scopes and were extendable at the back. Gumi also noticed the cars, which he describes as the color of tea when you add milk to it. Once Diblor arrived, the Somali soldiers who came with him also looked with horror at the scene, some of them saying they knew these men and knew they were civilians. The Somalis who came later were crying as they were looking at these people. One of them was asking why they killed these people and that he knew Ali. Why was he shot? Abdullahi says. A few minutes later, the soldier who had told Abdullahi and Gumi to get on the ground said they were released and got back into their car. With that, the Somali and American team packed into their vehicles and left the scene, the message that these were civilians having finally been relayed to them. With the help of the Somali soldiers who arrived with Diblor and stayed at the scene, they began collecting the bodies of the dead, still in shock from what had just transpired. When Abdullahi finally went back to his small home, he saw that the money on his shelf was gone. The soldiers had taken everything. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, the Somali Ministry of Information first announced that Somali soldiers had killed 8 al-Shabaab fighters in a raid on a farming village near Bariaya town and that no civilians were harmed or killed in this operation. But as the details of the operation reached Mogadishu, and elders from the Habajidia community as well as local administrators began speaking with local media about the farmers who were attacked, Somali officials started offering conflicting accounts of who the farmers were. The Somali president, Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, even published a tweet offering condolences to the families of those killed in Bariaya, which was removed minutes later. And as that news spread, so too did the public anger at the Somali federal government and their American counterparts. Diblor and the other farmers refused to bury their dead until the Somali government officially recanted their allegations that the farmers were al-Shabaab militants, bringing the bodies to Mogadishu to be kept in a refrigerated truck and shown to the Somali officials they believed greenlit the operation. By the time the bodies arrived in Mogadishu, which would have been an unprecedented act for al-Shabaab militants, dozens of family members and elders had spoken out in defense of the farmers, and hardly anyone in the city still believed they were extremists. Within days, even the chief of defense forces and minister of information admitted that it had been civilians killed in the operation. With the outpouring of public anger, the Somalia federal government opened an investigation into the incident, in the course of which government officials approached Diblor and others to collect information on who they were, why they had weapons, and what happened during the attack. But to much of the public's surprise, the federal government never made the outcome of that investigation public, nor did the Somali president ever officially admit that civilians had been wrongly targeted during the ground operation. According to one government official and one former security official, the outcome of that investigation not only confirmed that the farmers were civilians, but was buried under pressure from the United States government. According to these sources, the U.S. first tried to pressure Somali officials to deny the allegations that the farmers were civilians publicly, but knowing the political cost of doing so, the president of Somalia refused. Instead, to appease the families of the victims, the Somali government then paid them between $60,000 and $70,000 each, according to both of these sources, one of whom strongly believes was in fact paid for by the American government. The farmers refused to bury their dead. They brought the bodies to Mogadishu, with little public acknowledgement of wrongdoing from the national government. A former official then began an independent investigation into the operation, in the course of which he collected the shell casings from the area in the days after the attack. The Daily Beast saw photos of the shells taken at the scene as well as 5 individual shell casings in person in Mogadishu. According to multiple weapons experts consulted by the Daily Beast, the casings are a mix of both 7.62 by 39mm rounds, mostly likely from AK-47s such as those used by the SNA, and 5.56 by 45mm NATO rounds on M27 disintegrating belt links. The 5.56 by 45mm rounds are used by M249 squad automatic weapons or their lighter versions, the Mark 46 and Mark 48 machine guns, which are known to be used by U.S. special operators. These links are also stamped ALK, which indicates manufacture. At the Lake City Ammunition Plant, a U.S. government-owned facility in Independence, Missouri, which manufactures and tests small-caliber ammunition for the U.S. military. The Somalia National Army is not in possession of any weapons that would fire such rounds, according to a former high-ranking intelligence official who is now a senior security advisor to the Somali federal government. The Somali National Army only carry AK-47s, PKMs, and some DSHK machine guns mounted on the back of pickup trucks due to the long-standing arms embargo the UN Security Council imposed in January 1992. Additionally, Diblo, Gumi, and Abdullahi, all eyewitnesses of the attack's aftermath, noted that the Somali National Army soldiers present were carrying AK-47s which do not incorporate the type of machine gun belt link which composed the majority of those casings collected on the farm, while the American soldiers were carrying what they described as machine guns. This evidence strongly suggests that the American team themselves fired upon the farmers and that soldiers serving under the U.S. Special Operations Command can be held directly responsible for the deaths of these unarmed civilians. On September 29, roughly 1 month after this operation, the 4 outposts the Americans had established with the SNA around Bariaya town were overrun by al-Shabaab forces. According to the UPDF commander, the Americans and Somalis had set up 3 outposts on each corner of the city, 2 on the north side of the town with Danab, which had been posted to Bariaya after the farm incident, and SNA forces, and 1 on the south side across the Shabelle River with Gen. Shigo's SNA forces, with a bridge crossing over the river connecting them. Early that morning, al-Shabaab detonated 2 vehicle-borne IEDs of IEDs in Bariaya, the first of which destroyed the bridge connecting Shigo's outpost to the 2 others on the other side of the river. After the bridge was destroyed, another IED hit the Danab base and al-Shabaab fighters began to assault both the Danab and SNA northern outposts. By the end of the 2-hour-long siege, at least 40 soldiers were dead, according to a member of the SNA, and at least 10 of their vehicles and much of their equipment had been seized by al-Shabaab. The Americans came with that overconfidence that they could hold Bariaya, but even if you have better weapons, you have to know the terrain, says Gen. Mahanga, who also noted the Americans had visited the outposts the day before. They were overruns but left to return to Mogadishu. I warned them those outposts would be overruns. I warned them that those boys would be killed. The loss of Bariaya town signaled the end of the failed U.S. military campaign to retake and hold the area from al-Shabaab. Today, the town is under the control of al-Shabaab, and Diblo, Abdullahi, and Gumi, who have lost 10 of their friends, are once again subject to al-Shabaab's extremist rule. Update: 1:30 p.m. Est, November 29, 2017. In an apparent rush to preempt Daily Beast's investigation of the Bariaya incident, published earlier today, AFRICOM announced this afternoon that it had concluded its investigation. It offers no evidence whatsoever to corroborate its findings. This is the full text TAUG. 25 civilian casualty allegation assessment results released after a thorough assessment of the Somali National Armed Operation near Bariaya, Somalia, on August 25, 2017 and the associated allegations of civilian casualties. U.S. Special Operations Command Africa SOCAF has concluded that the only casualties were those of armed enemy combatants by U.S. Africa Command Public Affairs, United States Africa Command. Stuttgart, Germany, November 29, 2017. After a thorough assessment of the Somali National Armed Operation near Bariaya, Somalia, on August 25, 2017 and the associated allegations of civilian casualties, U.S. Special Operations Command Africa SOCAF has concluded that the only casualties were those of armed enemy combatants. Before conducting operations with partner forces, SOCAF conducts detailed planning and coordination to reduce the likelihood of civilian casualties and to ensure compliance with the law of armed conflict. U.S. Africa Command and the Department of Defense take allegations of civilian casualties very seriously. 4. Details on the August 25 operation, visit http://www.africom.mil. Media Press Release 29846. Civilian casualty allegations in Somalia. That link leads to the initial statement about the operation in August, which provides no details whatsoever. Civilian casualty allegations in Somalia. We are aware of the civilian casualty allegations near Bariaya, Somalia. We take any allegations of civilian casualties seriously, and per standard, we are conducting an assessment into the situation to determine the facts on the ground. By U.S. Africa Command Public Affairs, United States Africa Command, Stuttgart, Germany, August 25, 2017. We are aware of the civilian casualty allegations near Bariaya, Somalia. We take any allegations of civilian casualties seriously, and per standard, we are conducting an assessment into the situation to determine the facts on the ground. We can confirm that the Somali National Army was conducting an operation in the area with U.S. forces in a supporting role. U.S. forces are in Somalia at the request of the federal government of Somalia and are committed to helping Somali forces neutralize al-Shabaab and bring stability to the region.